Hello again, and God be with you. I hope you're all well. I've got another story then from Bob Hartman's Bible Baddies. This one's about a lesser known character from the Old Testament. It's written in Judges. Now, if you remember, Judges is telling a time when the Israelites have left Israel. They spent 40 years wandering around in the desert, and then under Joshua, they've entered the promised land. And for a couple of generations, things go reasonably well. But then they disobey God, and God arranges for the Moabites, the people who lived in Moab, to conquer Israel. And this is about what happened then. And as usual, Bob Hartman gives an introduction as to why he's written the story. The story is called The Avenger's Tale. When I was a boy, I never tired of hearing the tale of Eglon and Ehud. It was full of blood and violence and gore, a long way removed from all that stuff about gentleness and love that we usually heard about on a Sunday morning. But as I got older and developed a deeper appreciation for that love and gentleness stuff, Eglon and Ehud became a little more troubling, along with a lot of other Old Testament battle stories. And that's why I chose to include it in this collection. I admit that I've done a lot of imagining and reading between the lines in this retelling, and I've added a few things that you won't find in the Bible. But I've also tried to be true to what facts the Bible does give us. Eglon is still a wicked tyrant, an oppressor of the people of Israel. And Ehud is still one of God's judges, chosen to rescue God's people at a time of crisis, chosen to kill King Eglon. But even in the most just cases, surely killing has its repercussions. And that is what this story is about. Every night it was the same. For 18 years, the same. Ehud would wake up suddenly, cold and sweating and afraid. And that face, the face in the dream, would be laughing at him all over again. Shouting. That's how the dream began. The Moabites are coming. They crossed the river and they're heading towards the village. What next was a mad, rushing blur, a spinning haze of colour and fear and sound. His father's hand, his sister's screams, his mother's long black hair, goats and pots and tables, running and flying and falling down. And then, suddenly, everything would slow down again to half its normal speed. And that's when the man would appear, the laughing man, the fat man, Eglon, king of Moab. He would climb down from his horse, every bit of his big body wobbling. And with his soldiers all around, hacking and slicing and killing, he would walk up to Ehud's family, each step beating in time with the little boy's heart. His father, Gera, would fall to his knees, his mother as well, with his sister in her arms. And then the big man, laughing still, would raise his sword and plunge it first into his father and then through his mother and his sister too. Finally, the laughing man would raise his bloodied sword and turn to Ehud, 5-year-old Ehud. But before the king could strike, there would come a sound, a call from somewhere off in the distance. The king would turn his head, look away for just a second, and Ehud would start to run between the burning buildings, run past his dying neighbours, run until the nightmare was over, run until he awoke. Every night for 18 years. That's how the dream had haunted Ehud. But tonight, he promised himself, tonight the dream would come to an end. For today, King Eglon of the Moab, the fat king, the laughing man, the man who had murdered Ehud's family, would come to an end as well. Ehud thanked God for his family, and particularly for his father. and the gift that his father had passed on to him. It was a gift that not even the Moabites could take away, a gift that made him the perfect candidate for the job he was about to do, the gift of a good left hand. Most soldiers are right-handed. They wore their swords hanging from the left side of the body and reached across the body to draw them from their sheaths. That was what the enemy looked for. That was what the enemy watched, the right hand. For the slightest twitch, the smallest movement of that hand might signal that a fight was about to begin. So a left-handed man enjoyed a certain advantage, particularly if his sword was hidden. Ehud rubbed his eyes, rolled off his sleeping mat, and reached for his sword, the special sword that he had designed just for this mission. It was only 18 inches long, far too short for battle, but just the right size for strapping to his thigh and hiding under his robes. And it was sharpened on both edges so he could cut in both directions. He'd wipe the smile from the fat man's face all right, even if he had to slice it off. He'd waited for this day for 18 years. And for those same 18 years, the nation of Israel had been paying tribute to King Eglon. For the invasion which had destroyed Ehud's village had also swept across the land and resulted in Israel's surrender to Moab. And so, every year, great quantities of treasure and produce and livestock had to be delivered to the royal palace and presented to Eglon himself as a sign of Israel's submission. Today was the day, tribute day. And the man chosen to lead Israel's possession, chosen by God himself to walk right into the presence of the king, was none other than Ehud, the left-handed man, the man with the sword strapped to his thigh, the man who was finally in a position to set both himself and his people free. Ehud thought he would be nervous, but instead he was overcome with a sense of calm and purpose. He led the procession, according to plan, out of Israel and across the Jordan River, past the stone statues of Gilgal and into the palace of the king. He'd imagined this moment for years, face to face, finally with the man he hated most in all the world. What will I feel? He had often wondered. Hatred, disgust, the overwhelming urge to reach out and strike Eglon where he stands. All those feelings he knew had to be overcome if the plan was to succeed. He had to be submissive, polite and reverential if he was to win the trust of this tyrant. But when Eglon at last appeared, Ehud was shocked by what he actually felt. The big man was still a big man, now far heavier than Ehud had remembered. So heavy, in fact, that his attendants had to help support his weight as he staggered towards his throne. And as for laughter, there was none at all, not even a chuckle, just a hard and constant wheeze as the man struggled to move. Pity, that's what Ehud felt, and he couldn't believe it. Pity and the surprising sense that somehow he'd been robbed. This was not the man he dreamed of, the fat man, the laughing man, the nightmare man. No, this was a sad and pathetic man, crippled by excess and by power, and unable to raise a sword even if he wanted to. Still, Ehud reminded himself, there was the mission, the job he believed God had sent him to do. And pity or not, for the sake of his people, he would do it. And so he bowed, and he scraped, and he uttered the obligatory words. Noble potentate, ruler of all you survey, great and mighty one. Then he stepped aside as, one by one, the gifts were laid before the king. Eglon, however, hardly paid attention. He nodded almost imperceptibly and acknowledged he'd part of the tribute with the slightest wave of his hand. It looked to Ehud as if he was bored with the whole affair, or just too old and tired to care. When the formalities had finished, Ehud sent his entourage away, then turned to the king and said, "I have a secret message for you, your majesty." For the first time, Eglon looked interested. His dull eyes showed some spark of life as they focused on Ehud. "Silence," the king wheezed at his attendants. "This man has something to tell me." Ehud looked around nervously. "It's for your ears only," he whispered. "Perhaps if we could meet somewhere alone?" The king considered this and then nodded. "Very well," he agreed. "Meet me upstairs in my roof chamber. It's cooler there anyway. Oh," and here he glanced at the sword that hung from Ehud's side, the long sword, the decoy sword. "You will, of course, leave your weapon outside." Ehud smiled and bowed. "Of course." That smile never left Ehud's face, not once, while he waited for the king to be helped up to his chamber. For the plan was working perfectly, as all the spies had said it would. Eglon loved secrets, they had assured him. Dealing and double dealing, they explained, was how he had hung onto his throne. And that made this plan all the more sweet, for Ehud's robe concealed a secret the king would never expect. Finally, the guards called Ehud up to the roof chamber. They looked at him suspiciously. They took away the sword that hung by his side. Then they sent him in to the king. Ehud bowed again, and the king waved him forward. "So, who is this message from?" asked Eglon, and the cruelly calculating look in his eyes reminded Ehud at last of the man he saw each night in his dreams. "From one of your commanders," the king continued, "or from one of your spies? Or perhaps the sight of all that treasure has convinced you to speak for yourself, to betray your own people?" And with that, the king began to laugh. A little choked and wheezing laugh, but it was enough. Enough to rekindle Ehud's ebbing wrath, enough to force him to play his secret hand. "No," he answered firmly, "the message is not mine nor my commander's. The message I have for you is from God himself." And he reached his left hand under his robe and drew his sword. 3 times, that was how he had always planned it. Once for his father, once for his mother, and once for his poor murdered sister. But the first blow was so fierce that the sword plunged all the way in, swallowed up past its hilt into the fatty folds of Eglon's stomach. And even though Ehud tried to retrieve it, all he got was a fistful of entrails and blood. Ehud locked the chamber doors to buy himself some time. Then he hurried out down the servants' staircase. A part of him wanted to savour this moment, to stand and gloat over Eglon's bloated corpse. But if he was to avoid a similar fate, he needed to run. And he thanked God for the escape route the spies had plotted out for him. Down from the roof chamber and along the quiet corridors of the private quarters. That was the plan. And sure enough, he passed no one but a startled maid. He rehearsed it as he went. One more turn, one more hallway, and he would be out. But as he dashed around the final corner, he stumbled over something and he fell in a sprawling heap onto the floor. It was a boy, a little boy. "He's not hurt," thought Ehud with relief. "Who are you?" the little boy asked as he picked himself up and flashed a friendly smile. I'm It's not important, Ehud stammered. I have to be going. Well, if you see my grandfather, the boy said, will you tell him I'm looking for him? He said he would tell me a story. Your grandfather? Asked Ehud. The king, silly, the little boy grinned. Everybody knows that. And Ehud just stood there, frozen. He could hear the chamber doors crashing down. He could hear the shouts of the attendants and their cries. The king is dead. Someone has murdered the king. He had to go. He had so little time. But all he could do was stand there and look at the boy, and look at his own bloodied hand, and look at the boy again, and watch as the smile evaporated from his innocent 5-year-old face. And then Ehud ran as he ran in his dream, out of the palace and past the stone statues to the hills of Seirah. The army of Israel was waiting there, waiting for his return. And as soon as he shouted, King Eglon is dead, the army swooped down to the valley below. 10,000 died that day. Moab was defeated. Israel was freed. And Ehud had his revenge at last. And after much carousing and shouting and celebrating, he rolled exhausted onto his mat, looking forward to his first full night's sleep in 18 years. But unlike Ehud's enemies, the dream would not be so easily defeated. For as the night wore on, it returned, more real than ever. There was the little boy. There was the shouting. There was the slashing and the screaming and the dying. Ehud trembled and shook, just as he had done for 18 years. But when he looked at last into the eyes of the man with the bloodied sword, Ehud awoke with a start. For the man with the sword was left-handed, and the killer's face was his own. So Bob Hartman came to realise, I think as a lot of us do, that when we read the stories of the Old Testament when we're young, they all seem to be so great, all that fighting, all that winning. But he also says, revenge is not always sweet. Revenge doesn't always make the bad dreams go away. I'll have another story from the Bible Baddies next week. God bless you and sweet dreams.